Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference and the exhibition for an interesting opportunity to explore territory which is quite new to me. I must admit that I'd originally thought of this, I accepted this invitation slightly out of a sense of duty, but that sense of duty has disappeared, both from seeing the exhibition, Chibashi was certainly an amazing discovery, and also as a result of the fascinating papers I've heard today. So there's been a complete kind of revolution in my attitudes. Now, I should begin. When I was thinking about this before I heard the talks, it seemed to me that there were, and I'll come back to this later, there were two moments of Noguchi's intensive engagement with the Far East. One was as a result of his time in Peking and Japan in 1930. And then there was the visit in 1950, which of course led to his famous series of Japanese gardens. And it might be kind of interesting to think about the different nature of these two moments. It's been highlighted by the two talks we just heard, with Bart's talk really focusing on the 1930s moment, and Yasuka on the 1950s moment. Noguchi is a kind of, from my point of view, is an intriguing artist, because at one level you can see him as somebody who was grew out of a European and American art world, trained in Paris working with Brancusi, who then took an Eastern turn. And I think it's interesting, the first Eastern turn was actually more Chinese than Japanese, and the second turn was very explicitly Japanese. I am not a Noguchi expert at all. My one encounter with his Japaneseness has really been with his very intriguing public sunken garden sculptures, and also his and his sculpture garden at the UNESCO building in Paris, which I had the opportunity to see last summer, which I found very interesting. And you'll see there's a further reason for me having found it very interesting. Here's a couple of my not totally brilliant photographs of the garden aspect of this display. And then I think it's rather interesting that he also created this more sculptural display, which he himself said was the more important sculptural statement. Well, what's rather nice, this was done between 1956 and 1958. On the other side of the building, we have Henry Moore. And I think here is a wonderful contrast between two very different conceptions of how you could do a public sculpture for a building such as UNESCO. This really does make Moore look like the monumental sculptor. The sculpture bang in the middle of the building, a large white block. And of course, it's a large monumental figure. There's two things about this that I think are quite interesting. Firstly, though I think the two artists got on, I think this is a standoff between two big artists deciding to having this opportunity to make grand statements in this very important public context. What I also found interesting was that Henry Moore deliberately made a point of doing something that was not specific to the building. He just did one of his standard reclining figures. Noguchi said, Noguchi created a peace garden, which seems to me to be pretty appropriate to this particular setting. And it's actually one of the few of his sunken gardens or his garden sort of ensembles, which is so particular to the site. The Chase Manhattan sunken garden, for instance, isn't particularly, it's not got a huge amount to do with banking. So, to get to the talks, Bart really gave us a fascinating account of the ink drawings and also their possible later reverberations in Noguchi's work, interestingly saying that this is not necessarily just going to be echoed in more ink drawings, but is evidenced in a kind of picking up on some of the aesthetic of these drawings, particularly the aesthetic of the broad brush areas of the drawings in his later sculpture. And I think there's an interesting way in which a couple of those sculptures seem to me very much responding to the sort of Greenbergian notion of sculpture as drawing in space as well. One asks, though, why on earth did Noguchi did this? I mean, he produced this huge amount of drawings between sort of about 1928 and 1930, firstly in Parisian context, doing drawings of a sort of École de Paris, Jules Pascal, a little bit of Rodin thrown in. And then this amazing series of very large-scale, ambitious drawings, which he did in Peking. And it's very much a once-off experiment. And it's once-off in a number of ways. Firstly, there's very little figurative drawing in his later work. And I had a quick, this is a statement based possibly on profound ignorance. I scanned the Noguchi Museum's very useful catalogue of drawings and went through them. And what I found interesting, there's one other moment when he seems to have returned to a figuration, and so these are quickly downloaded images from their website. These were done during his tour around the world, which included the visit to Japan and the Far East in 1950 on Bollinger Scholarship. And these are kind of more traditional, sort of straightforward drawings, and what's crucial about them is that they don't have that key quality, the experimental quality that the drawings of 1930 have, and that is the combination of fine line with broad brush. He seems to have abandoned, so not only did he sort of abandon figurative drawing, but he also abandoned this particular way of working. And I think it's worth reflecting a little bit on what's going on there. And I was thinking that, this is, a number of people have put forward this hypothesis that in a way he was really just trying to work through the influence of Brancusi, trying to do something completely different, trying to make a break. But I think there's another interesting thing, and we discussed this briefly at lunch. What sort of an image of himself was he presenting? Here he was entering the New York art market in 1932 with an exhibition of scroll drawings, and I gather also an exhibition of portrait busts. What image of the artist was coming from this? And I think it's a question to ask whether anybody's got suggestions, was there anything in this critical response that picked up on this rather odd experimental self-presentation? Did people try to come up with a notion of artistic identity which would be constituted by these two? There was certainly a signaling of Far Easternness, and as they were called Peking drawings, it's not Japaneseness, it's Chineseness in this case. So it's very interesting to think about what might have been going on then. And it strikes me because if you move forward to the 1950s, when sort of calligraphic drawing became so big in the United States, and you take somebody like David Smith here, and these are drawings from the mid-1950s, this is a totally different style from Noguchi's, but it's exploiting those aspects of calligraphic drawing, particularly in the one on the right, where you have different kinds of notation combined with one another. And this brings me to another point, that a lot of sculptors, Henry Moore, Rodin, David Smith, produced a lot of drawings, and they produced a lot of drawings alongside their sculptures, and most of those drawings have nothing to do with their sculptures directly, but drawing becomes an exercise, and I find it very puzzling that here Noguchi discovered this way of working, which he obviously found quite satisfying, and then disrupted. Now, it didn't mean that he had to go on doing drawings that would relate to the sculpture, but I thought he might have wanted to just go on experimenting with this kind of drawing. Most of his later drawings, as far as I can gather, are designs for sculpture, and they often quite closely relate to his sculptural projects. So there's some quite interesting questions coming out of this. The other issue Yasuko raised, what her talk really brought out was the extent to which this ceramics, or the interest in working in ceramic clay, was really a very important international phenomenon. It wasn't just Picasso, it wasn't just Volcus, there was a whole crew of avant-garde artists who gathered in Albisola in Italy who did this and worked in this informal, experimental way, experimenting with glazes and so on and so forth. Fontana was there, Asker Jorn was there, so it's a big international, and what is interesting is that, of course, this was all in the international mode. This was using ceramics as an experimental form of sculpture, bringing in color and sort of very free-form fashioning of shapes. Um, so, one very specific question I have is what was made by Japanese critics of including Noguchi in an exhibition of Japanese ceramics? Because he's an American-based artist. I mean, however much he was sort of at that juncture, and I think one must remember it was only at this juncture he was really beginning to cultivate a sort of Japanese-ish persona. I think it began in the 1940s. So what was there any recognition of this, or was it just seen as perfectly normal? I find this kind of interesting, whether there was anything was raised about this. Just as I was sort of interested as to what kind of image of Noguchi emerged for the New York art world in that rather strange exhibition of work that he put on there in 1932. I've said enough, and I just want to finish by one small point. I started with this sort of 1930 moment of interaction and exchange, and then the sort of 1950s. It would be nice, I think, maybe the two speakers could think a little bit about what was the difference between these two moments. Not so much as regards how Noguchi had progressed, but how the art world was very different in these two different moments, and how this kind of interaction would have had a very different meaning. So.